March 11th, 2020 was the day the NBA suspended their season because of coronavirus, and specifically because of what happened at the Oklahoma City Thunder game. Bill Simmons from The Ringer, and who wrote a 700-something page book about basketball, tweeted, "This was the single craziest day in NBA history." But because it happened during the week when coronavirus really became known in America, I think a lot of the details of what was happening in the NBA world kind of got lost in the shuffle. And so for the 1-year anniversary of this, I wanted to go back and try to really understand what happened in the NBA and how did this all unfold. To start with a little bit of context on where we were on March 11th, coronavirus was headline news. So the New York Times front page had a bunch of different coronavirus articles. The stock market crash was well underway. We were about halfway to the bottom. That wouldn't come until later in March, but investors were aware of the virus and worried about it. March 11th was also the day when they announced there were 1,000 cases of the virus in the United States. There were probably more than that, but that was the count at the time. I think a good starting point for what happened in the NBA is actually a meeting of the United States House Committee on Oversight and Reform. There was an exchange between Glenn Grothman, who is a member of the House of Representatives, and Anthony Fauci, who is the face of the scientific community. Like in disaster movies, there's always one person who is the scientist. Anthony Fauci was that person for coronavirus. He went on to become a household name. He was all over TV, in the news. Brad Pitt played him on SNL. But that morning, he was asked about the NBA.
We mentioned earlier today that I think one of the basketball tournaments, I think for the Ivy League, they've cut off their tournament altogether. On the other, nobody talks about, every night they play 8 to 10 NBA games, and nobody talks about shutting them down. Is the NBA underreacting, or is the Ivy League overreacting?
We would recommend that there not be large crowds. If that means not having any people in the audience when the NBA plays, so be it.
So no hesitation from Fauci when he's asked about the NBA. He sends a loud and clear message on what he thinks should be happening. A little after 9 a.m. West Coast time, that's the timestamp on all of the tweets, Tony Jones, who is a beat writer for the Utah Jazz, tweets that 2 Jazz players, Rudy Gobert and Emmanuel Mudiay, missed morning shoot-around and are listed as questionable for their game that night in Oklahoma City. Quick background on Rudy Gobert. He's one of Utah's best players. He's a 2-time NBA Defensive Player of the Year, and he had just played in his first All-Star game a few weeks ago. He's one of the best players in the league at protecting the rim. He has like a 7'9" wingspan and just finds ways to interfere with shots. Also, on March 9th, 2 days before, he was in a media session and coronavirus came up. So as a joke, when he was getting up to leave, he touched all the equipment on the interview table. Eric Walden, who is a beat writer for the Utah Jazz, tweeted about it. He included a little laughing emoji and said, as Rudy Gobert got finished discussing the situation, he stood up, leaned over, and made it a point to touch every mic and recorder in front of him. So the Jazz have Gobert and Mudiay listed as questionable to play. Also that morning, the Jazz say they tested one of their players for the flu, strep throat, and an upper respiratory infection. And when all of those tests came back negative, they decided to test for coronavirus. About a half an hour after Tony Jones initially reports that Rudy Gobert is questionable, coronavirus is declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization.
We're deeply concerned both by the alarming levels of spread and severity and by the alarming levels of inaction. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
So there's already this domino effect of cancellations happening because of the virus, and the pandemic announcement just adds momentum to that. For example, in San Francisco, there's a weird little back and forth between the city and the Golden State Warriors, where a few days before, the city had put out a press release that recommended canceling all non-essential events, explicitly including sporting events. And then the Warriors put out a press release that said, we're going to ignore what the city is saying and keep playing our games and keep having fans at our games. So then the morning of March 11th, the city of San Francisco just places a ban on all events over 1,000 people, which means the Warriors can't have fans at their games. Here's the mayor of San Francisco talking about that.
We had expected everyone to follow the recommendation. It didn't happen, and as a result, we took it even further. I will say that the Warriors did what they wanted to do, and they didn't follow the recommendation, but they were well within their right to do what they did, and that's why it was important that we provided definitively that this should not be happening, so that we could provide them with the guidance to basically make it clear to them that this is not something that should have been allowed.
So London Breed is not having it. She's taking the virus seriously, and this was a bold call by her, especially since a lot of other big cities were not doing the same thing. And she was a pretty new mayor. It was her first time as the mayor of San Francisco, elected less than 2 years ago. Then, predictably, the Warriors come out and announce they will not have fans at their next game. But NBA teams are not on the same page about what to do at this point. It's midday, depending on the time zone. The Washington Wizards ownership group puts out a press release that the Wizards will keep playing games with fans. The Oklahoma City Thunder mascot announces he's ready to make some noise for the game that night. More to come from Rumble the Bison. And there was a tweet from the mayor of Oklahoma City that said, "Have you washed your hands in the last hour? Just checking." More to come from him too. So a general lack of alignment. So the NBA set up a conference call for all the team owners to try to get on the same page. The Athletic reported that they talked about canceling games, but that they were leaning towards playing them without fans like the Warriors announced they were going to do. About an hour after that, the NCAA announces via press release that they're going to play their March Madness college basketball tournament without fans. And then an hour after that, Sam Amick, who is an NBA reporter, posts an article talking about how things might play out considering what the NBA is and isn't doing at that point. He writes, "All it takes is just one player, one coach, one staff member to get infected, and their entire $8 billion a year revenue operation could be in jeopardy for the foreseeable future. Consider this much. The NBA deemed it necessary to change media rules to protect its players, with interviews now to be conducted with 6 to 8 feet of space between the subject and the reporter. Yet it's comfortable with 17,000 plus fans sitting inches apart, literally rubbing elbows as they share the armrest, all in the name of sustaining the bottom line. All the hand sanitizer in the world can't do anything about the fan behind you who doesn't know yet that they have the coronavirus and who coughs on all the unsuspecting fans below." It was interesting to go back and reread this article because it was posted in this little pocket of time right before things really started unfolding. Oklahoma City tweets their coronavirus guidance, which is take social distancing precautions like teleworking and avoiding large gatherings. And on March 11th, the idea of social distancing was still brand new. You know, people had no idea we were about to be asked to socially distance for the entire next year. Leading up to game time, the Jazz changed Rudy Gobert's status to out illness, and then 11 minutes later change it to all caps questionable. This is less than an hour away from the scheduled start of the game in Oklahoma City. There's also a game in Dallas with the same start time. Wired had some quotes about the build-up to that game from Mark Cuban, who is the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. He says that Luka Doncic, who is the Mavericks star player, asked if he thought the season could get interrupted by the virus, and Cuban told him it was, quote, highly unlikely. Mark Cuban also said he was expecting the arena to be about half full and was really surprised when he walked in and saw that it was packed. So all of the usual pregame stuff is underway in Dallas. Same thing in Oklahoma City. It just looks like the build-up to any other game.
Hispanic Heritage Night here at Chesapeake Energy Arena.
The Thunder post the starting lineups. They do the player intros. They sing the national anthem, and all of the players take the court. Quick tangent. It's also Hispanic Heritage Night at the Thunder game, and they have a bunch of stuff going on for that. They announce the starting lineups in Spanish. They have a mariachi band in the arena. They booked Frankie J to perform at halftime. He's an R&B singer, probably best known for Suga Suga, which he was featured on, and Obsession, both of which were top 10 Billboard singles in the early 2000s. He checks in on Instagram right around the scheduled start time of the Oklahoma City game and says he's on his way to the arena for his halftime performance. So all of the pregame stuff is done. The game is literally seconds away from starting, and the team centers were in the circle waiting for the jump ball. This is when things start happening. Kelly Fry, who is an usher, says she sees Donnie Strack, quote, literally sprinting out of the back hallway, headed towards the court. Donnie Strack is the Thunder's VP of Human and Player Performance. The New York Times writes, it was not immediately clear what was happening. In a bizarre scene, a member of the Thunder's medical staff sprinted onto the court and spoke to the referees. So there's a little huddle with the refs. You can see Chris Paul walk over and talk to Joe Ingles, and then walk away looking kind of confused. The crowd is on their feet this whole time. The cheerleaders are in their stands doing their thing. And at this point, the reporters who are covering the game start to tweet about the delay. Royce Young from ESPN is there and tweets, "Something is going on here. Thunder head medical staffer Donnie Strack just grabbed the three officials and told them something. All players were just told to go back to their bench. We're seconds from tip-off." One of the referees for the game that night who was in the huddle was Mark Lindsay, and he said, "It was a surreal moment. I'll never forget the eyes of 20,000 people staring at you. We were moments from throwing the ball up." Andy Larson is there covering the Jazz, and he tweets, "We have a delay here at Chesapeake Energy Arena. Now the coaches are being called to midcourt." Then a minute later, Andy Larson tweets, "Fans are being asked to chant OKC, but something is happening here. We're on the third loop of the Thunder's pregame music." It's clear that they're stalling and people are trying to figure out what's going on. Royce Young tweets, "Both teams are headed to their locker rooms. I think the game might have just been called." And then a minute later, that an official said he didn't know what was going on, but they'd been asked to delay the game. Says the players waved at fans as they walked off the floor. Because this is on social media now, people are starting to tune in and pay attention. Ryan Russillo from The Ringer tweets, "The refs just left the OKC game," and then 3 minutes later adds, "The refs just left the game because it's called, but people still don't know what's going on, and they have the hype team throwing out t-shirts and dancing to Lenny Kravitz." In the arena, they're just trying to fill time, going through all of the performers who were scheduled for that night. There's a PA announcement that says, "We are waiting for league confirmation to get this game started." Fans are still in the stands. Players are still in the locker room. Rob Perez, who somehow seems to be watching anytime anything goes down in the NBA, he checks in with an update on Rumble the Bison, the Oklahoma City Thunder mascot. He says Rumble is standing at half court launching threes over his head. You can kind of see him in the middle. At this point, the game is more than 20 minutes behind schedule. News outlets start reporting that the players have left the floor. SportsCenter says they're waiting for confirmation to start the game. Fox News Utah just says there's a delay of game with really no explanation of what's going on. They're at the arena still going through the performers. Apparently they have a kids' dance team perform. And then Tony Jones tweets, "Nobody but security currently on the court. Great balls of fire playing on the loudspeaker. eerie feeling in the crowd. This is absolutely wild. We talk a lot about how social media lets us share things in real time and the impact of that. I think social media also lets us go back in time and look at people's in-the-moment reactions to things. And I think there were a lot of those reactions captured on Twitter and social media from March 11th, 2020 that didn't really fully come through in the news outlets' retroactive reporting. And I think this Tony Jones tweet is one good example of that. In the arena, they're just going through all of the scheduled performers, which leads us back to Frankie J, who thinks he's singing at halftime, but the arena staff asks him if he can basically perform ASAP. There's a video on his YouTube of the whole interaction when they told him he was up and then of his performance. This is just the start of that.
Yo, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue the entertainment despite the delay. Pushing up our halftime performance. Fans, he was born in Mexico, raised in San Diego, California. He's a singer, songwriter, producer, responsible for hits like Don't Wanna Try, Sugar Sugar, and Obsessive. So many more where that came from. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. Grammy-nominated, multi-platinum recording artist, Frankie J!
After Frankie J's set at 5:37 West Coast time, 7:37 Central time, the Thunder Jazz game is officially postponed. Andy Larson tweets, mild boos throughout the arena, but mostly shocked faces. And there's an announcement made to the crowd at Chesapeake Energy Arena.
And fans, due to unforeseen circumstances, the game tonight has been postponed. You are all safe. And take your time in leaving the arena tonight and do so in an orderly fashion. Thank you for coming out tonight. We are all safe.
Sarah Todd was one of the reporters at the game covering the Jazz, and she wrote about the PA announcement, specifically the very last line where the announcers repeated, "You are all safe." Sarah Todd's comment was, "Nobody feels safe hearing those words." The Jumbotron at the game says it's postponed and the fans are leaving the arena at this point. While all of this is going on in Oklahoma City, there are 4 other NBA games that are in progress across the country. Charlotte at Miami, Detroit at Philadelphia, New York at Atlanta, and Denver at Dallas. And there's one late game on the West Coast that's scheduled between New Orleans and Sacramento that hasn't started yet, but fans are arriving at that game. Kevin John from ABC News in Sacramento posts a video and says, "Despite coronavirus concerns, it's business as usual here." So it's looking like the Sacramento game is on track, even as the Oklahoma City game is canceled. All the way on the other side of the world, Tom Hanks is in Australia to film a movie about Elvis Presley, and he announces on Twitter that he and his wife Rita Wilson tested positive for coronavirus. And this is what made March 11th feel so surreal, is that so many things were all happening all on the same day. The World Health Organization declared coronavirus as a pandemic, events were being called off, something weird was happening in the NBA, and Tom Hanks, one of the most famous actors in the world, says that he and his wife caught the virus. And then within 15 minutes of the Tom Hanks announcement, Shams breaks the news that Rudy Gobert has tested positive for coronavirus. Ramona Shelburne reported that the news about Gobert testing positive wasn't released until the Thunder fans were out of Chesapeake Energy Arena to avoid a situation where the crowd started panicking. Also, apparently the governor of Oklahoma was at the Thunder game. And the timing of everything that happened at that game is one of the craziest parts. There's an article where David Holt, the mayor of Oklahoma City, says if they would have gotten Gobert's positive test back at 6 p.m., they would have just canceled the game. If they would have gotten it back at 8 p.m., the game would have been underway and they just would have finished playing. But because they got the test back literally right before tip-off, In his words, it caused this surreal decision-making process to occur, not just in front of 18,000 people, but in front of the world. And across America, this is happening during commuting hours, dinner time, and prime time, depending on the time zone, when the most people are going to be tuning in and following along. After the initial announcement about Rudy Gobert, a lot of details started emerging. Royce Young tweets about why his status kept changing throughout the day from questionable to out, and that they thought he might play even close to game time. Woj tweets that the players for the Jazz and Thunder are being quarantined in the arena, and the reporters covering the teams are just posted up outside the locker rooms trying to figure out what's going on, refusing to move. Now, GQ says a stalemate ensued near the tunnel hallway. For hours, media members refused to budge from their spot, hoping to get a better sense of what was going on behind the scenes, which was really just the Thunder and the Jazz being trapped in their locker rooms. Everyone was stuck waiting around to get tested, and apparently Chris Paul took the opportunity to send over some beer and wine to the Utah team, which was a thoughtful gesture by him, as everyone was just stuck trying to pass the time and understand what was happening. The internet was, of course, reacting to all of this exactly as you would expect, including fantasy basketball owners. For some of them, the fantasy implications were a little piece of good news within the bad news of coronavirus. Others, it was like you could go onto Twitter and just witness all of the different phases of the grief cycle playing out. But the big news for basketball fans was the NBA was about to shut down altogether. The league's press release said, "We're suspending gameplay following the conclusion of tonight's schedule of games until further notice." It also mentioned that the affected player, which was Rudy Gobert, was actually not in the arena for the Thunder game. Ramona Shelburne reported that the announcement was made before other NBA teams were even notified, and it was a split-second decision by Commissioner Adam Silver, which meant that there were a lot of NBA coaches and owners and players who were getting these updates the same way everyone else was, just seeing the news on their phone. ESPN cut to coverage of the announcement, and they had footage of Mark Cuban reacting to seeing the news on his phone for the first time.
And that's where the hiatus will start. You could see right here the reaction from Mark Cuban when he got the news looking at his phone. And then he went and started to discuss it with members of the Mavericks organization on their bench.
He also alerted the officials that are in charge of this game.
The New Orleans Pelicans tweet that their game in Sacramento is still on and will be played as scheduled, which is in line with the NBA's press release. The New York Times runs an article about the suspended season, ending with what it means just from a purely basketball perspective. They write, "Now the conclusion of this unusual season is in doubt. With the Warriors on a sabbatical from their run of dominance because of injuries, the Lakers and Clippers have appeared primed to fill the void as championship contenders, along with the Milwaukee Bucks, who are led by Giannis Antetokounmpo, the league's reigning MVP. The playoffs were set to begin April 18th. So this is all happening basically a month before the playoffs and the most important time of the season for the NBA. Back in Oklahoma City, people are still basically stuck at the arena. Sarah Todd is one of the Utah reporters who's there. She tweets, "While this is a reporting situation, this is very scary for those of us that travel and cover the team." So they're waiting around. Meanwhile, in Dallas, the Mavericks game is finishing up. ESPN does an interview with Mark Cuban during the fourth quarter of that game.
Mark, first reaction. We got the shot of you reacting on the phone and seeing it. First reaction and thought when you learned that the season's been suspended.
This is crazy. This can't be true. I mean, it's not within the realm of possibilities. It's just, it seemed more like out of a movie than reality. Now that we're not playing games, what about all the people who work here on an hourly basis? You know, we'll put together a program for them, but, you know, there's just so many things that go through your head, right? It's hard to know exactly what's right.
Considering all of the news that was just coming out, I thought it was cool to hear Mark Cuban, as the owner of the team, be really quick to think about the impact on everyone who works for the Mavericks and what he could do to help them out. There's a check-in from Frankie J. He posts a screenshot that shows his name is trending on Twitter and says the only Corona that he's going to have is with some lime and salt while he rests for his flight back home. Frankie J is one of my favorite parts of the story because he was caught in this weird, stressful situation and just stayed positive and made the most of it. You know, standing mid-court at an NBA game and singing has got to be nerve-wracking enough without having to worry about weird energy in the arena and your performance being moved up and coronavirus on the loose. At this point, there's also a lot of work happening behind the scenes in terms of contact tracing, trying to understand, who could have been exposed to the virus and if any actions need to be taken based on that. And they realized that one of the referees at the game in Sacramento had actually worked at the last Utah Jazz game 2 days ago. Rob Perez shared a video from the very end of the game in Atlanta. The Hawks put Vince Carter in for the final few seconds, and Vince Carter had been saying he was going to retire after the 2019-2020 season, and when he made the official announcement over the summer, he had played the most seasons in league history, and he was the first NBA player to play in 4 different decades. Early in his career, he was known for All-Star Weekend dunk contests, including his forearm in the rim dunk and the crowd's reaction to that.
All right, Vince Carter with his first on the final round.
Ladies, wait, time out. Can I take a timeout?
Have we ever seen that before?
Can I take a timeout? Well, I saw.
Over the years, Vince Carter had turned into more of a three-point shooter, and when the Hawks put him in for one last shot, he took a 3 and made it. And it turns out that when the NBA resumed their season after the coronavirus shutdown, not all of the teams were invited to continue playing in the bubble, including Atlanta. And so the Vince Carter shot really was the last play of the Hawks season and of his career. Back in Sacramento, Will Guillory is at the game covering the Pelicans and writes, "I'm standing next to the Pelicans locker room and they still haven't walked out for warm-ups. There's 9 minutes left on the clock. They usually would have been on the court by now." 3 minutes later, Sam Amick says, "The Pelicans, I'm told, are pushing hard for this game not to be played. Team officials are on standby. The Kings are already on the court. Tip-off in 5:30 and no Pelicans." At this point, all the other NBA games had wrapped up. There was some buzz following the Dallas game, partially because of the Mark Cuban interviews, but also partially because Boban had gone for a career high. Boban is a center for the Mavericks and a fan favorite across the league. He's listed at 7'4", 290, so he's one of the biggest players in the NBA, and he put up 31, really got going late, scored more points in the fourth quarter than the entire Nuggets team. He was making hustle plays throughout the game. He had multiple putbacks down the stretch, and the crowd in Dallas was into it. There was also a great quote from Rick Carlisle, the Mavericks coach, who was asked what his thoughts were in the middle of the game when he found out that the NBA was suspending the season. He said, "My thoughts were we needed to win this fucking game." In Sacramento, tip-off was supposed to be at 7:30, but the Pelicans players still had not taken the court. This was when Bill Simmons tweeted, "Single craziest day in NBA history. It's not even close. Stay safe out there, everybody." About 10 minutes after the scheduled start time in Sacramento, the Kings announced their game is postponed.
Out of an abundance of caution and at the direction of the National Basketball Association, tonight's game has been postponed.
Nick Zilak says, as they announced the Pelicans game was canceled, the cameras focused on a fan licking his entire palm to get all the popcorn butter off. Coronavirus is about to win on easy mode. Back in Oklahoma City, there's more news starting to come out. Royce Young checks in and says there's a group of people that showed up a few minutes ago and it appears they're here to test the Jazz. And he then goes live on SportsCenter to give an update.
Right now, I'm told that the Jazz are sitting in their locker room, lined up in a circle. They all have masks over their face, and they're going to be tested by Oklahoma health officials for the virus. And the test basically involves opening their mouth, sticking their tongue out, having their inside of their cheek swabbed almost to the point where you will gag. You don't want to turn this into a cruise ship situation in all seriousness.
Correct.
So all these Utah Jazz players have been in the locker room with Rudy Gobert, been touching the same basketball. They've been on the same flights as him. You know, I've been talking to some of the Jazz reporters, and they feel like they need to get tested. I was talking to Tony Jones of The Athletic, and he was saying he doesn't really feel comfortable getting on an airplane.
There's also more news that's coming out based on the contact tracing work that's happening. Ben Barrett from Airways Magazine reports that the airplane the Jazz used to fly into Oklahoma City was later used to transport both the Orlando Magic and the Memphis Grizzlies. You start to wonder if those teams were impacted. You also start to just think about who else was in the arena at the Thunder game, from security to vendors to the cheerleaders who were on and off the court walking through the sections. Kaylee Marshall is one of the Thunder cheerleaders. Someone asked her about tests, and she said they did not have to get coronavirus tests, but that they also weren't around the players. All of the news that was coming out had to be unsettling for anyone who was in the arena. They had been told, you're safe, you're not at risk, but that's what the whole country had been told. You know, don't worry. But we were sitting here watching a major sporting league abruptly shut down on live TV. I remember that being nerve-wracking, and I was thousands of miles away on my couch just texting about it. So I think it had to be a lot to think about for the people who were actually there in Oklahoma City, and for the people who were still in the arena. Royce Young tweets that there's a 4-hour wait until the Jazz players' tests come back, and that plans are being made for the Jazz to stay at the arena overnight. Sarah Todd's article says, "We couldn't just go back to our hotels. We couldn't get on a commercial flight and risk possibly infecting countless others. We didn't know what was going on, so we sat and we waited." LeBron checks in on Twitter and says, "Man, we're canceling sporting events, school, office work, etc. What we really need to do is cancel 2020. Damn, it's been a rough 3 months. God bless and stay safe." At 10:25 West Coast time, so well after midnight Central, Andy Larson says, now they've asked the media to come into the Jazz locker room to get tested for the virus. And a few minutes later, that the Jazz did not have a hotel booked in Oklahoma City for the night. They were planning on flying home after the game, and so everyone had checked out of the hotel, and they were trying to figure out a place for them to stay overnight. George Yang, who is a forward for the Jazz, says, "We were stuck in that locker room for 6 hours. People were saying we're going to get you to a hotel to get tested, but we knew between us, what hotel is going to take 53 potential coronavirus hosts?" The Athletic writes, hotel after hotel rejected them as Thunder officials worked with the mayor of Oklahoma City and the NBA to find an accommodation for the Jazz. And they finally secured one, getting to the Residence Inn near the Oklahoma City airport at around 1 a.m. So that was March 11th, 2020 in the NBA. Obviously, it was a story within a much bigger story, and it's tough to draw a line on where this part of the NBA subplot ends, but a few follow-ups that I think are worth mentioning. The next day, March 12th, Donovan Mitchell announced that he tested positive for coronavirus. He's Rudy Gobert's teammate on the Jazz, the team's leading scorer, and a fellow All-Star. People continue working on contact tracing. The Oklahoman reports that Donovan Mitchell had worked out at a local high school before the game while he was in Oklahoma City. Rudy Gobert posts a picture on Instagram with a little update on how he's doing and a little apology. The Thunder players all get tested, and Bill Russell chimes in on the NBA's decision. He is one of the all-time NBA greats, Hall of Famer, 11-time champion, who is now in his mid-80s, and he writes, David Stern, who is the former commissioner of the NBA, would be proud of Adam Silver and his decision to suspend the rest of the season. It was the correct call. Keeping everyone safe is priority number one in times like these. It's a great concern for my generation. Be smart and safe. The next day is Friday the 13th. The Oklahoman reports that the Oklahoma State Health Department has tested about 100 people for coronavirus, including 58 from the Utah Jazz, and that after all of those tests, they have about 250 coronavirus tests left for the rest of the state. There's an update from Frankie J. He got back to his home in San Diego, says he received a lovely message from a Thunder employee thanking him for coming to Oklahoma City, and that if he's invited to perform at another NBA halftime show someday, he'll gladly accept. One final article and one final tweet. The article is from the Oklahoman, which writes, "What happened Wednesday at the peak changed the way Americans think about coronavirus. Average Janes and Joes didn't seem all that concerned about the pandemic before. Now they see how close the danger is and how quickly the spread can happen. Until Wednesday night, coronavirus was something happening to other people in other places. Now it's happening to us. Oklahoma City was ground zero for that change." I know that's not true for everyone and that there were people paying attention to coronavirus before March 11th, but personally, I remember being glued to the news that was coming out that night and that things started to feel a lot more real. The final tweet is from Charlemagne, who writes, 115,000 cases of coronavirus worldwide, 4,200 people killed, and some Americans didn't think shit was real until Tom Hanks, Rita Wilson, and the NBA were hit with it. Start using your own brain and stop waiting until celebrities are impacted to take things serious. So, the Oklahoman article says the NBA suspension made coronavirus real for America, and Charlemagne asks, why is that what it took? This is my first YouTube video, so clicking the like and subscribe buttons is really appreciated and should really help other people be able to find this. Or if you know someone who might like it, you can share it directly. And if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Since this is a video about coronavirus, big thank you to the people who are getting us through the pandemic, essential workers, medical professionals, the scientists creating the vaccines, and also everyone in the vaccine trials. I feel like we never talk about them, but being one of the first people to try a brand new vaccine is pretty brave too. Last but not least, one of the unfortunate parts about the coronavirus lockdown is a lot of people have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, but just because they happen to be working in the wrong industry at the wrong time. So if anyone's looking for a way to help out, little donations can go a long way at food banks. There's a link below to the Feeding America website. They're one of the biggest charities in the country, and because of that scale, they say they can turn $1 into 10 meals. And they also say that almost all of the money donated goes directly to their programs and not to random overhead costs. So I challenge anyone who's still hanging around watching to donate even just $1 to Feeding America or your local food bank. Thanks for watching.